So good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 2018 Evnin Lecture. This is presented by the Princeton University Council on Science and Technology and co-sponsored by the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. And I want to acknowledge all of our sponsors. Our support at the Council for this annual public lecture series comes from the very generous donation of Tony B. Evnin, who is Princeton class of 1962, and he is director of the biotech company Venrock Associates. My name is Naomi Eric Leonard. I'm a professor in the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department. I'm also director of the Council on Science and Technology. Our council fosters university-wide engagement in science and engineering, exploring the societal impact of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, also known as STEM, promoting innovative teaching and research and new ways to live at the intersection of STEM with the arts, humanities, and social sciences. We seek to ensure that all students graduating from Princeton can be exemplary citizens, voters, and leaders with the ability to assess and appreciate the science and engineering issues of the day. So we have a wonderful guest and lecture in store this evening, and I'm delighted to see everybody here, despite all the snow and power outages. So to introduce our speaker, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Sam Wong from the Princeton Neuroscience Institute and the Department of Molecular Biology.
Thank you, Naomi, and on behalf of the Neuroscience Institute, thanks to the Council on Science and Technology for all the good work that it does in bringing two people together on campus in the interests of science and society. It's an honor to be intermediate between you and our guest of honor today. Thanks a lot. It is a rule of thumb that when we really honor our guests, we have introducers who have introducers. And so I am the intermediate introducer. It's a pleasure to welcome Rush Holt home again to Princeton. I think many of you have known Rush Holt for many years because he is an old-time resident of this region and in fact represented this area for a long time in Congress, and so he has worn many hats. There's so much to say about Rush Holt, but because of his deep roots in Princeton, I think many of us in the room think of him with special warmth. As you already know, I think, Rush Holt in 2015 became the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Executive Publisher of the Science Family of Journals. In these roles, he leads the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific and engineering membership organization. Let me just talk a little bit without getting too lengthy about his life and many accomplishments. He's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, degrees in physics, master's and PhD from New York University. He's an elected fellow of AAAS, the American Physical Society, and the Honor Society Sigma Xi. He's married to Margaret Lansfield, a physician. They have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and so he has a rich life that we could talk about. But tonight we're hearing from him in the domain of policy and science. Over his career, Rush Holt has held positions as a teacher, scientist, administrator, and policymaker. For years, he was assistant director of the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory on the other side of Route 1, which is a Department of Energy National Laboratory, the largest research facility of Princeton University. While there, he helped establish the lab's nationally renowned science education program. Before that, he was on the faculty of Swarthmore College, where he taught courses in physics and public policy, and so his joint interest in science and policy has been with him for a long time. I want to call attention, for those of you who are interested in the intersection between science and policy, to one major step of his transition into policy. He already was familiar with Capitol Hill, but he did take leave from Swarthmore to serve as an American Physical Society and AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow on Capitol Hill. It's a fellowship program that dates back to 1973, set up by AAAS to place outstanding scientists and engineers through multiple branches of government, executive, legislative, and congressional assignments. And that program now has more than 3,600 alumni working worldwide in the policy, academic, industry, and nonprofit realms. And let me just say on a personal note that I also held this fellowship in 1995-96, and we looked up to Rush at that time as someone who had come through that program and was doing major work. He had done since at that time worked in arms control, had worked in other domains of public policy. And so we actually, as scientists, really saw him as one of our heroes, and we thought of him as something that we could become someday. And like him, I found the AAAS Fellowship to be career-changing. Now, an introduction of Rush Holt is not complete without mentioning that he represented us, as I mentioned, a long time in Congress. He served for 16 years as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, representing New Jersey's 12th Congressional District. And while in Congress, he served as a member of the Committee on Natural Resources and the Committee on Education and the Workforce. He established a long track record of advocacy for federal investment in research and development, science, education, and innovation. He served on the Glenn Commission, which was the National Commission on the Teaching of Mathematics and Science. He was a co-chair of the Biomedical Research Caucus, and he served 8 years on the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and he strengthened legislative oversight of the intelligence community. He, Scientific American magazine named him one of 50 national visionaries contributing to a brighter technological future, and a champion of science by the Science Coalition. And so I would just simply say that, that when we think about public service, whether it be in Congress, elected office, or in the public sphere and policy, he shows us that it is possible to lead a life of integrity and to serve the public through his works. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight Rush Holt.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam. And I am delighted to be here. It's good to see many friends here, and I look forward to the conversation with you and some discussion a little later on. I'd like to talk about a few things. First, about the nature of science and the intersection between science and public issues. I do want to recognize the generosity of Tony Evnin, who started these lectures many years ago. And he's a Princetonian and a good friend of the university. And there have been many distinguished speakers. I'm humbled to be in this succession of speakers in the Evnin Lecture. In fact, I thought I remembered a connection, and sure enough, I looked up. I was an Evnin Lecturer 19 years ago. And so I wanted to ask the organizers tonight, did you invite me back to see if I'd get it right this time? Or if I'd learned anything in 19 years. In any case, I am delighted to be back. Some things have happened in my career since that time, 19 years ago. I finished 16 years as the representative of 750,000 people here in central New Jersey, where I spent a lot of time interacting with all sorts of people. I can sort of summarize my work there. I remember one letter I got. I answered all my mail. One day the letter said, "Nice vote, lame brain." I also have had some dealings with Watson and Jeopardy in the meantime, in the last 19 years. But all of this time, I have continued to think about the place of science in our society. What's so special about science? What does it have to give humanity? Why is it worth supporting? And starting with just the question of, well, what is it? What are we talking about? Well, tonight I certainly want to talk about science writ broadly, including engineering, technology. The organization that I now head, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has the mission of advancing science, engineering, and innovation for the benefit of all people. It's a worldwide endeavor. AAAS is an international organization, and science is very much a trans-border undertaking. When I'd like to begin with just a few quotations, I guess they are, of some key points in my journey through science and into policy. I remember reading in Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi, when he said, science is a most wonderful thing. You get such a wholesale return in conjecture on such a trifling investment of fact. Well, he was talking about facts. It's a wonderful quotation. Of course, I read that and I said, well, it's good for a laugh, but he's right. You do get such a great return from science. It is generalizable in a way that allows Fraunhofer's spectrum of a flame to be applied to the sun, and recognize that the sun is not a perfect celestial sphere, but in fact it has the same elements that Fraunhofer found in his laboratory in Germany, just by looking at the spectrum. A wholesale return in conjecture on this very simple observation. Of course, it can be carried even farther to look at the atmospheres of stars, of planets around stars 150 light years away. Or you can use the cosmic distance ladder, using parallax of some stars and then finding variable stars, and take some various steps to be able to determine the dimensions of the entire universe. Such a wholesale return in conjecture on such a trifling investment of fact. Well, I'll say a little bit more about this word fact. I will try to avoid using the word fact because it's kind of slippery. I think you'll know what I mean. But I do want to talk about science in general. Lewis Thomas, known to folks here in Princeton, not just as a name on a building, but a distinguished microbiologist and physician, once wrote in an article on science education in the New York Times about why it shouldn't be as hard as it is to teach the essence of science to students. He said, few see science as the great adventure it really is, the wildest of all explorations ever taken by human beings, the chance to catch a close view of things never seen before, the shrewdest maneuver for understanding how the world works. I love that phrase. Lewis Thomas called science the shrewdest maneuver. The point is, it is not obscure terminology, methodology, mathematics. It is all about understanding how things are, and a shrewd maneuver, no less. Another quotation I take from my orientation period when I was a AAAS American Physical Society Congressional Fellow. As you heard from Sam, this is a program that AAAS has run since 1972, I think it is. And this year, for example, we have 270 PhD level scientists in all three branches of the federal government, working as regular staff members on a congressional committee or in an office of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or in many other spots around. And there I was sitting with several dozen newly appointed AAAS fellows at various stages in our career, accomplished scientists. And one of our first speakers said, now you scientists have to understand that here in Washington, we treat facts differently. The next speaker from the Office of Technology Assessment, rest its soul, said, you have to understand that here in Washington, facts are negotiable. Well, this got me thinking for years, right even to now. Well, what do we mean by scientific facts? Of course, there are lots of jokes. You could make them about how public officials, elected officials, treat the facts. Haywood Hale Broun once tells the story of standing in the back of the room where one man mutters, "That politician is murdering the truth." And another friend said, "Don't worry, he won't get close enough to hurt it." But the attitude toward truth, toward facts, toward evidence is really what I wanted to get at this evening. When I served in Congress, one of my colleagues, this was in the fall of 2001, shortly after the attacks on the Trade Tower and on the Pentagon, and when a terrorist sent through the mail spores of anthrax, Bacillus anthracis spores, that killed some postal workers, infected some people on Capitol Hill. And my colleagues came up to me and said, "You're a scientist, you must know about anthrax." Well, I scratched my head wondering where in my physics curriculum I had missed the part about Bacillus anthracis. But I knew what they were saying. They were saying two things that really troubled me. One was, you understand science, and never mind that you were trained in physics, you understand science, and you are one of the people who has the keys to this storeroom where the facts of the world are kept. The other thing they were saying is, I could never understand science. Those are two very troubling things, because science is not and should not be thought of as a collection of what is known and what is not known, of facts cut and dried. Nor should it be thought of as the realm of scientists and only that. It is what scientists do, and only they can do it. I found that troubling. I certainly marvel at the accomplishments of scientists. I marvel at the success of science. Ever better precision, ever better accuracy. The success of science is remarkable, where you can learn things to, dozens of decimal places even. And it does seem to be different than most people's thinking. Danny Kahneman, economist from Princeton, has said that, when people are 99% sure of something, they're wrong maybe 20% of the time. Not so with scientists. Science is truly remarkable. And right now, you could argue that it's never been better. There are major advances in almost every field of science, leading to a better and better understanding of the world. The kind of behavioral science that Daniel Kahneman brought to economics makes economics all the more valid. The detection of gravitational waves and concurrent measurements of electromagnetic radiation from colliding neutron stars has told us not just about neutron stars, but has answered a number of long-standing questions about physics and the universe. And immunology is realizing long-dreamed-of therapies. These are really good times in science. But there's some troubling signs as well. Troubling signs in how the public understands science, troubling signs in how we are investing in science for the future, troubling signs in how science is brought to bear in service to humanity. It's troubling to scientists that the US president has failed to appoint a science advisor, among other things. But what is even more troubling to me is that the public has reacted to this with a yawn. Maybe some of you in this audience are scientists, and you've talked with people at the lab about this failure to appoint a science advisor, but I'd venture to say it has not made the cut of dinner table conversation at many dinner tables around the country. There are a number of surveys, one that I was recently involved in, one called Perceptions of Science in America by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, looking at a number of, consolidating a number of surveys about the perception of science. And they point to consistent, strong support for science. And yet, underneath that, if you ask somebody, do you support science? Do you think it's good for society and our culture? Sure, love science. If you ask a politician, do you like science? Oh, they say, oh yeah, I love science, it's great. We got to do more of it. Well, did you vote for research and development? Did you vote to discontinue the advanced ARPA-E Energy Research Center? Well, maybe I did, but I love science, you know. But even more, these surveys show that underlying these supportive views or these supportive words about science are enormous differences at different demographic crosscuts. So depending on a person's identification with, say, political party or race and ethnicity or sex or other group identities, the attitude toward climate science or vaccinations or genetically modified foods or any number of other things can differ greatly. In other words, they are saying, well, I believe it if it fits for me. Well, if you're going to pick and choose when the scientific method yields good outcomes, I think you don't understand the scientific method, or you don't embrace it. That's what I find troubling. Now, we can approach these people and say, but science works. I mean, it's, you know, cures for polio, terrific search engines at Google, eradication of smallpox, the number of families who are necessary to work to feed the rest of the country have gone from 50% to 2% through better crops, better fertilizers, in other words, through science. There are all of these better understandings about where you can prospect for oil and how you can capture the wind. Vannevar Bush, after the Second World War, delivered a report to then President Truman saying that scientific progress will lead to progress in fighting disease, in national security, in public welfare. And therefore, it is vital for the government to support science. A pretty logical, straightforward argument. People bought it at that time. But talking about the payoffs from science seems to have worn out, because all is not well now. The federal investment in research and development is half of what it was in the 1960s. Now, the private sector has picked up a lot of that, but they do different research than the federal government does. It's more product-oriented, more development than research. And a lot of this is subtle. There hasn't been in any legislative body, as far as I know, in more than 100 years, an effort, as there was in the Indiana legislature, to legislate that pi is equal to 3. Or it's uncommon, but not unheard of, for legislators to say that evolution comes straight from the pit of hell, the idea of evolution, although those are words of a member of Congress from just about a decade ago, or another member of Congress who called climate change the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American public. No, most of the things are not that confrontational to science. Rather, it's just a sense that we don't quite push hard enough to get the most out of science, that we don't believe science all the time, but only when it fits, only when it's convenient. Some people are troubled by the fact that scientific studies have shown that forensic techniques that have been used to convict a large number of people, whether you're talking about fiber analysis or bite marks or footprints or fingerprints or fire investigations, are not on good scientific grounds. And yet, prosecutors are continuing to go before judges and juries and say, we know this. This is solid. You've got the right guy here. Congress has, despite a number of efforts in recent years, has failed to revive the Office of Technology Assessment. This was an agency of Congress that existed for a couple of decades, really did very good work. I tried, I think, every year that I was in Congress to revive it without success, and that failure has continued since I've left. Now, members of Congress are mostly smart, hardworking, altruistic. They're a distillation of society. So I don't want to pick on them specifically. What we see there is a problem that is widespread in our society. A sense that science is for scientists, that science is what scientists do, that it's not really relevant to me, or at least it's not something that I could ever know anything about if I wanted to. In other words, you're a scientist, you must know about anthrax. I won't, and I don't. I'll just take my alternate facts. I'll just listen to my fake news. You know, the number of unfounded claims about many things is disturbing to scientists. It's not disturbing enough to everyone else. And so what are we going to do about that? You know, Frank von Hippel, longtime professor here at Princeton, once said he was brought up in elementary particle physics, where an unfounded claim could be a career ender. Well, just read the news every single day, and that does not seem to be true in the public realm. Unfounded claims abound. What you might have thought would be reason turns out to be spin. What you might have thought was analysis turns out to be assertion. What you might have thought was debate turns out to be posturing. And whether you're looking at, I mentioned earlier climate science and GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and vaccinations and evolution and gun violence. At the time of the Iraq War, whether there were weapons of mass destruction, whether voting is verifiable and secure and reliable. There is not much critical thinking, not much demand for evidence in any of these areas. When was the last time you heard somebody say, with respect to an argument, whether it's about tax cuts or trade agreements, well, what's the evidence? I guess the simplest way to sum up what troubles me about all of these things is the comment I frequently get from people, most recently from a group of middle school students. Do you believe in climate change? It's not a matter of belief. You should be asking the question, what's the evidence? But they don't think about that, and in fact, it takes a few minutes to explain to them the difference between their question, do you believe in climate change, and the question is, what is the evidence about climate change? That, I think, summarizes the problem we face. So, I've ever since that day in 1982, I guess it was, when with the congressional fellow trainees, we were told that in Washington, facts are negotiable. I've thought about, well, so what are the characteristics of science? And it's you can invent things, you can explain things, you can predict things. It's beautiful, often surprising. And some of these characteristics I describe this way, that it's empirical, it's based on evidence and observation and experiment. That's the starting point. What's the evidence? It's self-correcting, it's open, it requires free expression, it uses international language and very much international collaboration. It's democratic, small d, in the sense that it's not hierarchical or aristocratic. It's not what the experts say, it's what the evidence says. It's what comes out of the science. It's what allows a lowly patent clerk in Switzerland to turn all of the world of physics on its head. It's generalizable, as I was saying earlier, trying to show that Mark Twain was more right than he realized when he was joking about wholesale returns of conjecture. It's progressive in the sense, again, small p, not in a political sense, but that progress is possible. That today's findings are different from yesterday's findings. That you can actually make progress. And it's all really because it's provisional and tentative. Scientists always, if they're honest with themselves, recognize their fallibility and recognize they're engaged in an enterprise that is supposed to guard against their fallibility, that is supposed to protect them from deception, especially self-deception. That's the genius of science. And it traces back to something Einstein said so well, which is the most incomprehensible thing about science is that it is comprehensible. That the universe can make sense if we keep working at it. And we can get closer and closer to it. Now, it's fun, of course, to contrast all of these characteristics with what I observed on Capitol Hill for years in politics and law. It's not generalizable. It's very local and specific. In fact, all politics is local. It is not progressive. It is a temporary balancing of interests. That's what politics is. That's what it's meant to be. That's what it's designed to be, and that's not bad. But it's not science. It's often closed in procedure as opposed to the idealized procedure of science, which is open. It is not open-ended. It is, the agenda is set in politics and often on a schedule. And it certainly is hierarchical. The committee chair or the party boss does carry more weight than the person with the facts. And so in politics, you're seeking consensus first and then looking for the facts, maybe to bolster that consensus, which is the absolute opposite. But I go through those just for a little amusing digression. If you combine the idea of progress of science with the democratic ideals of science, in other words, the fact that it's available to everyone, everyone can do it, you end up with progress widely shared, or the American dream. So that is the greatest service to humanity. It is not the spin-off, a particular cure or a particular gadget that we are most indebted to science for. It is this anti-authoritarian, liberalizing idea that it is possible to find out how things are. And then we can use that for the basis of how we want things to be. So if you're going to make policy, rather than starting with an ideological assertion, as so many people do, you should start with the best understanding you can find of how things actually are. That should be the starting point of policy. And if we want to integrate science into our public lives, that's what we should be doing, is getting policymakers to understand that their starting point should be the best understanding of how things are. And that's what science gives you. It's not perfect, and sometimes our understanding of how things are has to be reversed. It doesn't mean that the science is bad. It means that science is working. It is getting a better and better approximation of how things actually are. So, Jefferson tried to put this in a political sense or a social sense by saying that the sun, things like that, work not because wise men said so. Solutions are not reached because wise men say so, but arrived at empirically. And Jefferson went on to say, reason and experiment have been indulged and error has fled before them. This community of scientists, and it is, by the way, communal. I mean, a lot of scientists work in isolation, going through collecting their data or doing their statistics and whatever. But ultimately, It is a communal and indeed public undertaking. There may be moments of solitary reflection, but openness and collaboration are necessary for science to work. Certainly scientists draw support from the public and toleration from the public and from society, who fund, in many cases, the scientists' work. But even more, the verification of science, the exposure of deception, must be public. It's why a necessary part of being a scientist is publishing, so that you can be part of this communal verification of the truth, well, or at least to review the evidence, so that maybe someday we can arrive at a truth. So the definition of science over these decades that I've tried to find seems to be something like this: that science is a way of asking questions so they can be answered empirically and verifiably. It's pretty simple. So they can be answered with experiment or observation. Science is a large part of it is asking questions and asking them in the right way so that they can be answered empirically. And then the communications have to be open so that the verification can take place at large. It's not necessarily fast, it's not necessarily efficient, but it is remarkably successful if practiced in that way. There's a lot buried in that simple definition, but it's a definition that even a third grader can understand. In fact, third graders are pretty good scientists. They know what it means to answer a question based on observation. They love to do it. They know what it means to have somebody check your work so you can avoid fooling yourself. I wish in our educational system we didn't beat this out of the kids after the third grade, because everyone could do this. And we would all be better off if we all did. If this natural scientific curiosity was not only permitted, but nurtured. Not that everyone would be a scientist, don't get me wrong there, but everyone would know what it means to think like a scientist. That would take us a long way towards solving a lot of our problems. Well, what do we do about this? About the fact that scientific thinking is not brought to bear on gun violence, on weapons of mass destruction, on voting, on climate, on GMOs, on vaccinations, that personal prejudice and membership in some, or self-identification in some group carries much more weight than the evidence. Well, one thing you can do is learn communication techniques. Science communication, this is something we do at AAAS. We have workshops. We teach techniques in science communication. In fact, it's often called the science of science communication. What we have learned about how people learn, what we have learned about how people listen, what we have learned about what people hear when we say what we think we said. I'm not going to go through such a course now, but you clearly have to pay attention to your audience's values. You have to seek common ground. You have to earn the trust. You have to have the humility that is supposed to be part of science. Science should be the humblest way of thinking because it is based on this idea of provisionality. It is based on this idea that your your findings about the world are good as far as they go. It's curious, however, that science, which should be the most humble of practices, is often seen as practiced by arrogant people. Leon Letterman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, once said, the physicist's prayer is, "Lord, grant me humility." Now, by humility, here's what I mean. So, we need to communicate science for what it is, this ingenious system that can help people who are actually not so brilliant make good decisions and see new things. The other thing you can do, and here I'll finish with a plug, is join AAAS. You know, I left Congress several years ago. I spent a brief time at the Institute for Advanced Study, and then I went to the American Association for the Advancement of Science as the CEO and executive publisher of Science Magazine, which you may know, and our other publications. AAAS is the world's largest general science membership organization from dozens of countries. We have 250 affiliated societies, and we call ourselves the Force for Science. I told you our mission a while ago, which is to advance science, as is our name, for the benefit of all people. It dates back to the 1840s. Science was not a general term that was in wide use then. But starting even then, AAAS has sought to advance science on many fronts, through convening, through communicating, through representing evidence whenever possible, and sounding the alarm when necessary. To engage the public, to speak for engineers and scientists. We give journalism awards. We have mass media fellowships for grad students, science grad students who want to spend the summer working in a media outlet, whether it's Univision or the Philadelphia Inquirer. We have Eureka Alert, which gets breaking scientific ideas out to science writers. We have a new service called SciLine, which is a contraction of Science, Deadline, and Byline, which helps writers get the science right in their stories by connecting them with good communicators who can help them get the science right. We give the Golden Goose Awards every year to research that has previously been ridiculed or might have been, publicly funded research that's turned out to be very valuable. For example, recently we gave the Golden Goose Award to a study sponsored by the Department of Agriculture called The Sex Life of the Screwworm Fly. Well, you might imagine that received some ridicule, even in the halls of Congress. It also turns out that by learning how to introduce an entire generation of sterile males, of the screw fly, you can save ranchers and herders billions, literally, of dollars. We have programs in science education and science and public policy and science and the law, science and human rights. Many of the dimensions, the other dimensions of science that aren't in the lab. In fact, we have a program that I like to call a program for students, for graduate students, that I like to call what they don't teach you in graduate school. Those things that a scientist should know. But all of this, banding together, learning the communication techniques, is to help us advance this idea that science is relevant. It's not just for scientists. That science is powerful. It is not just ivory tower. That science is accessible. And we have started, we actually made up badges. We're trying to promote the idea that citizens at every turn should ask one simple thing: what's the evidence? That science is not about assertion. It is not about what the experts think. It is this shrewd maneuver, as Lewis Thomas said, for understanding how the world works by repeatedly and insistently asking the question, what's the evidence? The greatest gift of science over the last 500 years, the greatest gift of the greatest intellectual advance of the last 500 years, is science itself. It is not the spin-offs, it is not the cures, it is not the inventions. It is the idea that we can understand how things are and progress from there. That is the greatest service of science to humanity. Thanks. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on this or questions. As I used to say in my town meetings, if you look around the room, take a quick estimate of how many people are here and multiply it by 3 minutes, you would realize if you're not brief, we'll all be here longer than you want to be. But I'd like to hear from you. Yes.
I'm really interested in what AAS is doing in terms of science and human rights. I get the newsletter and like emails, but I'm wondering if you could just tell us a bit about that, because I think that's a pairing that a lot of people don't put together.
Right. Well, we just, it's a lot of, AAAS operates on many different fronts, on many different timescales, and with many different communities. In human rights, for example, some years ago, we convened the Coalition on Human Rights, which is a group of several dozen scientific societies that felt that this dimension of science was something they should devote some time to. And that, and we have a regular staff at AAAS that works on questions of scientific freedom and responsibility, human rights, and the law. So we've had a major campaign to try to educate people on the Human Rights Declaration, the UN Human Rights Declaration, which most people don't realize has a clause in there on the right to science. Science is meant to be open to all people, both in its practice and in its product. We're undertaking we undertook a number of studies over the years. A friend of mine used to work at AAAS, was in Argentina recently, and he said, you wouldn't believe the hero's welcome that I got because they learned that I had worked at AAAS. And they were so grateful for what AAAS did to apply the techniques of science to reunite the orphaned children of the disappeared with their grandparents by DNA matching and so forth. We have a fairly extensive program in Central America now, looking at discovering mass graves by using ground-penetrating radar and other techniques. We've had quite an extensive program over a number of years documenting the destruction of cultural icons using remote sensing, drones, satellites, and so forth. That's really a human rights issue. If you leave a community culturally unmoored by destroying their cultural centers, it really is an inhumane treatment and casualty of war. So that's some of what we've done. We just produced a statement on scientific freedom and responsibility that I wish I had with me. It's suitable for posting on every laboratory or office door, just as a reminder of these other dimensions of science. Oh, okay, over here. Yes, Sam.
Yeah, I just wanted to propose a way forward on some of this with a quote and a statement. Francis Moore LePage wrote, "Our real problem is not a heating planet or rampant malnutrition. We only have one real problem, our own feelings of powerlessness to manifest the solutions right, or the evidence, right in front of our noses." And so I think the lack of institutions that are up to dissolving the powerlessness is what gets in the way of progress. And one example, and I'll just get your reaction. The day before Trump was inaugurated, there were 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats on a House Climate Solutions Caucus. It was 10 months old. It was not a year old yet. And today there are 36 Republicans and 36 Democrats. It's young and it hasn't done much. But getting one Republican on anything with the word climate in the title 3 years ago would have been kind of impossible. So it's a step in the right direction. And it really came out of an organization committed to dissolving the powerlessness so people could get organized, look at the evidence, and then speak effectively to elected officials on both sides of the aisle. And I think there's too little of that.
Yeah, I know very well the remarkable, marvelous, admirable work that you've done, Sam, to, among other things, get this bipartisan climate caucus going in Congress, which is scrupulously bipartisan, and that goes a long way nowadays because it's so rare. And on this family of science issues, we at AAAS have been involved in advocacy for 170 years, but we're trying to do a better job now of doing that at the local level, really using the talent and the numbers of our membership, 120,000 strong. We've got a ways to go in that, as I think you know, but it is something, something we're working hard on that I think you will be hearing a lot more about.
Your comment about people being choosy about which parts of science they want to accept or reject falls into that classic logical fallacy called argumentum ad consequentiam, argument by consequence. I like or dislike the consequences of a proposition being true, therefore it must be true.
Or not.
True.
Yeah, that's, you know your Latin and your rhetoric. That is exactly what we're talking about here. Well, it's one one manifestation, or it's one thread of what we're talking about. It is more generally people choosing their conclusions on the basis of, as I said, group or identification or secondary or self-interest. Yeah, the consequences. Supposedly, Senator Inhofe, who is known as one of the strongest opponents of climate science, said to, trying to remember who it was, that, well, you know, I used to believe in what the climate scientists say until I learned what the cost of the solution would be. Yeah. Okay. Yes. That's.
I'm struggling with the changes in the U.S. coming from the removal of the words climate change and global warming from the EPA archives, current documents, everything. Climate change is just a name.
Yeah.
It's a name that's attached to a scientific series of measurable events. And what I'm struggling with is by erasing the name, a lot of people gave themselves permission to not believe in the science. How do we, within AAAS and we as a public, reemphasize the facts of global warming and reemphasize that it is a factual-based concept? And how do we help people in our community and back to our Congress start to believe in these series of measurable events again instead of this climate change?
Yeah, I mean, you can, yeah, you can say that climate science is just measured evidence, but it has also been made to be an attack on people's sense of self, people's welfare and ability to support their family, and in fact, it has all sorts of baggage having to do with taxation and immigration and any number of other issues, so that it is no longer possible to have a strictly scientific discussion about climate. So that's why we have to look for techniques of finding common ground with the people who have been sold this disinformation. It's not just misinformation. It's been deliberately planted erroneous information. We have to find ways of talking with the people who have been affected by, in a sense, have bought that disinformation in ways where we can talk about them without threatening their values, or in fact, maybe by engaging their values. Easier said than done. Sam.
I wanted to ask a follow-up that's related to the climate change question, more in the political domain. So, as a scientist, I'm interested in climate change based on facts and observation and hypotheses, and I've got this really substantive, narrow view of it where I get agitated with people who don't look at that. But I was triggered by something you said that made me think about this from a different perspective. You held it up as a very positive thing that it used to take 50% of the people of this country to feed it, and now it takes 2% of the people. And for me, science is a source of hope.
Yeah.
But 50 minus 2 is 48. And for 48% of people, those 48% of people had to find something else. And if I'm going to turn it around and ask about economic displacement, ask about desperation, ask about people in the Rust Belt or in farm country, there are places where science and technology are not necessarily positive things. And if they stop to think about it, we might get it with a pitchfork. And so I'm just curious as to how, as a scientist, as the CEO of the leading scientific organization of the nation and perhaps the world, how does one grapple with the fact that science isn't a positive thing for large segments of the U.S. population?
Yeah, the way I see it, but this is hard to communicate, and, you know, I have to, you know, again, say in all humility, it may not even be right, but all of these farmers and their families found other work. It's almost totally true, I think, that over the last 100 years, during which period this happened, the safety and the quality of work in every other profession has improved, so that they have been able to move into jobs that are, in a sense, better. Now, there clearly are lots of judgments embedded in that. I mean, you know, sitting at a typewriter, some people may not think is better, but it is safer and more reliable than what they were doing in farming. You know, a more reliable income, better health benefits, and so forth. So you could argue, yes, they had to change jobs. Change is disruption of any kind is hard for people. And so they may not thank you. And I don't want to be so arrogant as to declare they are better off. But I do think most people would say we're better off as a society, and almost every individual is better off, that we don't have to spend, that 50% of our family doesn't have to spend the time in a fairly dangerous, onerous occupation of farming in order to feed the rest.
I'm saying it's true for drivers. Drivers will go away in the next 20 years.
Okay.
I'm just
If
saying-
that's
just-
true,
I'm
yeah,
saying-
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just- I mean,
yeah.
I see your point, but I think disruption hurts.
Yeah, it's, the farming statistics may not be the best measure of progress attributable to science.
It just feels like
But
a hard
I
problem.
think most people would see it that way.
You know, it just feels like a hard problem, what to do about displacement in places that are not receiving,
Yeah.
the, you know, are not receiving the benefits of science uniformly.
Yeah. Okay, let's take these two, yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned some programs for graduate students that
Yeah.
AAAS runs, and you mentioned that there are things that you would, that should be taught to graduate students that aren't. So what's one, maybe the most important lesson that you wish some PhD students were?
Well, something, let me list a few things that are not uniformly taught to graduate students. You might, you know, in your department or with your advisor or at this university, you know, it might not all apply. But I would say science and communication. How to communicate with scientists, how to communicate with non-scientists. There's some things you could learn in a one-day workshop that could be invaluable. Science and public policy. How is your research funded? Not what's the grant number for your NIH grant, but rather what does this country do to support research and development? And how is that determination made? In other words, well, that. Science and human rights. It's something most scientists don't think about. And I would argue that there is an obligation to look after the human rights of scientists, certainly, and also to apply the techniques of science to evaluating and defending human rights. There are public engagement, which goes beyond communication, but how we do the kinds of things that Sam was talking about to give scientists the power to change their future. That's, and perhaps the future for everyone. there are career choices. You know, there is this My IDP that a lot of grad students use. In fact, in some places, it's required that they work with their advisor to make their career plans. There's, I think, a lot, actually, My IDP is something that is administered by AAAS. There are other variations on it, but that's maybe the best known as My Individual Development Plan, I think is what it stands for, isn't it? Anyway, so I could go on. There are a number of things like that that are kind of other dimensions of science, science and society kinds of things that, you know, maybe there isn't time to teach in graduate school, or there's nobody local who feels competent to teach it. What we try to do is to give an introduction. You can't, I mean, you could teach a full semester in any of these areas, but in a day or two, you can let graduate students know, well, these are some things you can think about, and here's where you can follow up on them.
Maybe just one more.
Okay, sure. Yeah, sorry to go on so long. Yes,
Yeah, so you
I
talked
promised
a
you.
bit about, and I guess we hear about it in the news, policy decisions that are not based in science, but I was wondering if you could talk about any organizations that do have a scientific base for their policy, and maybe not science organizations, but some other sort of organization.
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, maybe you were thinking when I mentioned gun safety that that's not a science matter, but I would argue that if our best hope of finding solutions in the area of gun violence is by treating that as an epidemiologist would treat it, rather than as a constitutional lawyer would treat it.
Do you know any organizations that make policy decisions based on these sorts of processes?
Oh, I see. Sure, you can find some policies that are scientifically grounded. I mean, in the landmark legislation in the EPA, going back to the 1970s, about 1970, in that era, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, those were designed, I would say, with good science in mind. They realized that the best approach would not be to have a checklist of banned substances or banned procedures, but rather to have a way of evaluating what the science says about the effects of this pollution on people, to keep up with the times. That's why those acts have grown over the decades, because they weren't rigid legislation. And that they were passed with I think, a pretty good understanding of how science progresses. So, you know, it happens from time to time, not as much anymore, I'm arguing. And, you know, I don't have time or really the ability to nail that down. But it is, you know, as I say, the prevalence, there seems to be a greater prevalence of unfounded assertions, and there seem to be more policies based on such things. At AAAS, we have another new, I mentioned Sciline a few minutes ago, we have something else we call the Epicenter, which is the Center for Evidence in Public Issues, where we don't try to make policy, but we try to show decision makers and influencers what science has to say about their options. There are a number of interest groups that in some limited areas, you know, have really good policy shops, policy recommendations. I can't think of anybody who does that across the board. The Office of Technology Assessment, which used to exist in the US Congress, didn't actually make policy. It too laid out options, but it was across the board. So it was climate and oceans and energy and fisheries and strategic national defense, missile defense, and, you know, any number of things. For missile defense, they said the options are zero. What the space-based missile defense just won't work. But for the most part, they had a much better array of options available. And OTA, for no good reason, was abolished in now 25 years ago, almost. There was, well, there isn't anything really since to replace it. Thank you.